So far on this channel, I've spent a lot of time analyzing video games, digging into the mechanics and design decisions of countless different titles to see what makes them tick. Something I haven't tried yet, though, is analyzing someone playing a game. I haven't actually looked at how these mechanics and design decisions impact a real human, besides me, of course. The more I thought about that concept, the more it intrigued me. So I've enlisted the help of my girlfriend to assist with a different kind of video. For this experiment, we're subjecting her to the trials and tribulations of Dark Souls, the infamous game known for being particularly difficult and, shall we say, unforgiving. Here are the ground rules. My girlfriend, what's her name again? Ellie, there we go. Ellie is going to play Dark Souls for 5 hours collectively. The 5 hours will be spread into hour-long increments over multiple days, as opposed to trying to do it all in one sitting, which would just be too much. Ellie does have some gaming experience, but she knows next to nothing about Dark Souls. She's likely to have many questions, but I won't be answering any of them. No matter how stuck or frustrated she may become, I am not allowing myself to provide any assistance whatsoever. Other than that, there really aren't any rules or guidelines. She's got 5 hours to play however she'd like and get as far as she possibly can. All of the Dark Souls B-roll you'll see throughout this video is her gameplay, unless otherwise marked as being played by me. Okay, with all of that established, let's jump in and see how she did. After a brief moment with the character creator, Ellie selected the warrior class and jumped into the game proper. Her opening minutes were defined by trepidation. While Ellie had never played or watched Dark Souls, she was aware of its infamously difficult reputation. Fearful of missing something important, she moved through the early hallways and rooms at a very slow pace to make sure she didn't miss anything. It's interestingly similar to the way I first played it back in the day. Regardless of your skill level, Dark Souls has a way of making you feel like you're always on the verge of screwing up. While Dark Souls is a very open game, the first real level is self-contained and essentially functions as an extended tutorial. Strewn around the area are various messages that provide tips on how to play the game. You've also got a few low-level enemies and a boss to cap things off. Once you beat the boss, you're free to begin the game in earnest, but even a tutorial is challenging in a game like Dark Souls. Unsurprisingly, Ellie was quick to read the tutorial messages as she explored, but what was interesting to me is that she seemed to pay mind to some more than others. For example, a number of the messages teach you how to perform moves like dashing or dodge rolling. Ellie would fiddle around until she pulled off the move, but then she'd move on and never really incorporate it into combat. At one point she was taught how to lock onto enemies, an extremely helpful mechanic, but she couldn't figure out why she would need to do that, so once she left that room, she stopped doing it. There was one message though that completely struck her: get your shield. As soon as she read this message, Ellie immediately began repeating that she needed to find a shield. As she began searching, I started to wonder why she was so taken with this message in particular. I think there are two reasons. Firstly, while most of the messages are more explanations, this one is phrased as a command. Get your shield, with an exclamation mark. The wording makes it sound urgent and non-negotiable, while others sound more optional. Secondly is that, simply put, Ellie knows what a shield is. There are numerous terms within the Souls series that have become integral to the zeitgeist, but if you've never played one of these games before, you'd have no way of knowing what they mean. At one point, Ellie found a message mentioning an illusory wall. Now, as a player of this series, I know that such a message refers to a wall that will disappear if struck. Ellie, though, didn't know that. Elsewhere, she discovered Estus flasks, something all Souls players know as your trusty healing item. Again, though, Ellie didn't know this terminology, so it took her longer to understand what the item does. Dark Souls isn't just difficult because it's hard to accomplish your goals, it's difficult because it can be hard to even distinguish what the goals are. So when Ellie sees shield, a term most everybody knows, she latched onto it. Over the first hour, Ellie became increasingly familiar with the opening area and checked off some quintessential Dark Souls bucket list items. She lit a couple of bonfires, which act as respawn points, and even had her first death at the hands of the game's first boss. Now, it's essentially impossible to defeat this boss on your first attempt, as you're initially equipped with a broken sword. What you're supposed to do is run into a nearby doorway that separates you from the boss. From there, you loop around the area, acquire a proper sword and shield, and reunite with the boss once you're sufficiently equipped to take it down. Ellie was progressing through the level at a solid pace, but was having trouble finding the sword and shield. Without those items, she started to hit a wall. The first few enemies you encounter are complete pushovers, but once you get past those, they become stronger. You can attack and even kill them with the broken sword that you start with, but it deals a minuscule amount of damage, making the process very difficult. Since Ellie hadn't found a sword, she began attacking these enemies with the default broken one. She had already died a couple of times, but this was when the deaths really started rolling in, and yes, I will reveal her total death count toward the end of the video. She kept trying to defeat all the enemies, but they would always swarm and overwhelm her. On occasion, she'd attempt to run past them, but that just led her back to the boss, which again is essentially unkillable without a proper weapon. This section highlights a classic logical fallacy to which every gamer eventually falls victim. The notion that doing the same thing over and over again will eventually produce a different result. Now, of course, sometimes games are just hard and simply demand repetition until victory is achieved. But other times, the game will communicate to the player that they may have the wrong idea. In this example, Dark Souls was communicating to Ellie by showing her how little damage she was dealing to the enemies. Despite attempting to push forward for quite a while, Ellie was getting the message as she began to repeat out loud that she felt like she was doing something wrong. Despite her suspicions, she wrapped up the first hour stuck in quite a rut, still without proper weaponry. The day after Ellie played the first hour, I realized that I'd forgotten where the sword and shield are actually located. I checked a walkthrough online to find that they're placed in a hallway that Ellie had already explored, but when she ran through, there weren't any items. Confused, I went back and checked the footage and came to find that Ellie actually picked up both the shield and sword during my one and only bathroom break. So, as we began hour 2, I knew we had a problem. Ellie did have the weapons she needed, but didn't seem to realize that they were in her possession, as she was distracted by an enemy shooting arrows at her when she grabbed them. Despite not realizing this specifically, she continued to insist that she had missed something or was doing something wrong, prompting her to run back to the beginning of the game to retrace her steps. She combed around the rooms and reread tutorial messages, which after a few minutes led to a breakthrough. After rereading that she could open a menu to change her equipment, she finally dabbled in the appropriately named equipment menu, which turned out to be Dark Souls' most nefarious enemy yet. Ellie in this menu simply did not click. She was able to glean that she possessed a functional sword and shield, but could not figure out how to actually equip them. Her primary point of confusion was that she started trying to equip the items from her inventory, which the game doesn't allow. What you need to do is select an empty slot on the equipment menu, and then you can equip any appropriate piece of equipment that you have in your possession. After almost 10 minutes of trial and error, I began to worry that Ellie wouldn't ever try that. It was in this section of the playthrough that I really started to struggle with not saying anything. One element that struck me the most in this experiment is just how difficult it is to stop yourself from providing any kind of help to someone who needs it. Obviously, I could have explained this menu situation to Ellie, and it wouldn't have taken more than 30 seconds to equip what she needed. I could have told her that she already had the items she was looking for, but that would largely defeat the purpose of this video and what makes such an experiment so interesting. I may take menu navigation for granted, but I've completed hundreds of video games. This is a different perspective, one that I think is very enlightening. Thankfully, just as I was wondering how much longer I could keep my mouth shut, Ellie equipped the shield. She immediately felt silly for taking so long, but remained adamant that the mechanics of the menus weren't well explained. Unfortunately, she didn't equip the functional longsword that she'd also picked up, so while she was now able to deflect projectiles, she was still dealing a measly amount of damage. Thankfully, Ellie grasped this quickly and equipped the sword as well. Now, enemies that seemed borderline invincible could be killed in 1 or 2 hits, completely changing the game. Totally re-energized, Ellie ran back to the boss and, wouldn't you know it, killed it on her first try. It's at this point that Dark Souls really starts to crack open. The player is transported to the kingdom of Lordran, where the rest of the game takes place. Also, crucially, the player can now use the souls they gather from defeated enemies to level themselves up. By upgrading any number of different stats, the player can increase their max health or stamina, damage output, damage resistance, etc., etc. Essentially, you can make the game progressively easier for yourself. As soon as she landed in Lordran, Ellie used the soul she'd acquired to do just that. She didn't really understand what each stat improved, but she was leveling nonetheless. While the tutorial area is mostly linear, the remainder of Dark Souls is much more open. While it's not entirely open world like its spiritual successor Elden Ring, it does afford opportunity to explore in a myriad of different directions at once. I'd liken the game's structure to an anthill, featuring plenty of defined branching paths, but not true unrestricted freedom. Dark Souls' gameplay loop settles into pushing forward slowly, taking on any enemies that appear, and looking for bonfires and bosses alike. Recharged from her victory over the first boss, Ellie set off to see what she could find. Pretty quickly, she discovered that these new enemies pack quite a punch relative to those that she'd already fought. These skeletal warriors are quite aggressive and high in quantity. Ellie was able to take them down pretty easily, but would just as often be killed when they would gang up on her. Dark Souls is a game best played methodically. By rushing forward, you risk these types of scenarios. Ellie's best bet here would be to take one enemy at a time, but she kept moving too quickly and attracted multiple foes at once. At this point, it was becoming increasingly clear that not targeting enemies was making the game significantly more difficult. She'd never really even started utilizing this mechanic to begin with, so I wasn't optimistic that it was ever going to be incorporated. Despite this, Ellie was still making progress and seeing more of the initial areas. On a couple of occasions, she got extremely close to a bonfire, but didn't seem to see it and ran in another direction. She didn't make it much further before a pack of enemies would take her down. Before she could press onward anymore, Hour 2 had come and gone. At this point, it seemed like Ellie was grasping the baseline mechanics. She was becoming more comfortable with combat and had gotten used to taking a step back when necessary to take a swig from the Estus flask. I was feeling optimistically about the progress being made. Ellie began the third hour of play by refamiliarizing herself with the controls, as it had been a few days since she touched the game. It's really interesting how going more than 48 hours or so without playing a game elicits a sort of disorientation. This happens to me as well and can make it hard to get back into a game if you've taken an extended break. Despite this, Ellie was quickly back on track. She began exploring down the same proverbial path that she'd been pioneering during the second hour. Unfortunately, she was still struggling with besting all the enemies, particularly when they presented in larger groups. Sometimes the timing would work out in her favor and she could best them, and other times, not so much. I really started to notice during this time that Ellie seemed compelled to kill every enemy she came across. There's nothing in the game that states she had to do so, but I find that players unfamiliar with a game are often inclined to fight more often than flee, as if there's some sort of unspoken obligation to eliminate any visible threats. As her patience waned, though, Ellie began skipping enemies off the beaten path. She also began to dabble more with luring a single enemy away from its group, a valuable tactic that began to make some combat encounters easier for her. I was really curious to see how long it would take her to discover that bonfire I mentioned earlier, and thankfully, my question was answered quickly. Ellie happened to see this alternate path when fighting an enemy, and when she entered inside, she noticed it, but then did something that surprised me. Fearful of respawning the nearby enemies that she just defeated, she opted not to interact with the bonfire at all. Of course, this led me to scream internally, as I knew that resting there would unlock it as a checkpoint, but she didn't remember this from earlier in the game. She decided to leave it alone, died shortly thereafter, and respawned back at the beginning of the area. At this point, Ellie was growing increasingly frustrated and losing hope of any more meaningful progress. She was making it a bit further with each attempt, even traveling all the way to the next boss at one point, but felt stagnant nonetheless. It's fascinating to take a look at what mechanics she was making use of in an effort to make progress. For example, she latched onto the idea of using fire bombs to assist her in combat, but without targeting the enemies, this item is pretty much useless, leading her to ditch them after a little bit of experimentation. What's more interesting though, is what mechanics she wasn't making use of. Despite focusing so much on acquiring the shield earlier in the game, she was hardly using it at all. Personally, I don't even equip a shield, opting instead to dodge roll around enemies like I'm on some sort of illicit substance, but Ellie wasn't doing that either. She was so focused on defeating each enemy that she seemed to largely forget about defense or evasion, at least one of which is paramount for success. She appeared to accept that damage was inevitable, so she just killed her opponent as quickly as possible and then drank a flask. Of course, Estus exists in limited quantities, so that strategy can only get you so far. At this point, I think the most damaging omission in Ellie's approach to Dark Souls is ignoring the latter part of that title, the Souls. It can't be overstated how much easier the game gets if you level up. If you're willing to grind, you can increase your level way higher than what's intended for a given area. I do this in every Souls-like that I play. Other than when she first arrived in Lordran, Ellie hadn't leveled up a single time. I'm assuming she just forgot about that mechanic or perhaps didn't fully understand the function of souls. At one point, she mentioned wanting to accumulate souls, but I'm not exactly sure what she was expecting to do with them. Without improving her baseline stats, it's unlikely that Ellie could progress much further. Thankfully, she did finally decide to rest at the newfound bonfire and had to put the controller down for a second when she realized the bonfires act as checkpoints. Technically, the game had already taught her that information, but it was so early on that it would be easy for someone to forget. It speaks to how unforgiving Dark Souls can be, not just in terms of the enemies or traps, but in terms of the information it provides. If you forget a certain tutorial, or even worse, never see it at all, the game has no interest in repeating the information. Before Ellie could make any other discoveries, Hour 3 had finished. As Hour 4 got rolling, things quickly took a turn for the worst. Within about 5 minutes, Ellie received a message that her weapon was at risk after she attacked an enemy. If you're familiar with Dark Souls, you likely know that weapons degrade as you use them. Once your weapon of choice reaches a certain level of degradation, its damage output is severely reduced, limiting your effectiveness in combat. Your options are to repair the weapon or switch to another one. Ellie immediately took note of the message, but she didn't understand what it meant. It's slightly strange wording and doesn't include any kind of follow-up explanation. She continued onward, but took note that she seemed to be doing less damage. With a neutered weapon, Ellie struggled where she hadn't previously. Enemies gave her significantly more trouble. Since she had to hit enemies so much more to kill them, she also kept running out of stamina, a mechanic that I'm not sure she ever really noticed. This often left her open to attacks. She was getting really frustrated, and I worried that this might be the end of the road, but just as I'd accepted that, Ellie jumped back into her inventory. She fiddled around for a while and eventually swapped over to the battle axe, one of the many weapons she'd accumulated while fighting and exploring around. This one seemed to suit her even better than the longsword. With axe in hand, we were back on track. Ellie trudged back towards the Taurus demon, and while she occasionally perished before arrival, she was making it to the boss more consistently. Each time, though, she met a swift defeat. One quirk I picked up on that I see with new players of basically any game is that Ellie would almost always attack an enemy more times than was necessary. 90% of the time, an enemy would die and begin falling, but she'd still give him an extra swing for good measure. It's funny to me that as you learn how long it takes to kill particular enemies, you develop a sense for the exact number of hits that'll get the job done. For the remainder of the hour, Ellie dug in and made it to the Taurus demon 3 additional times. She was definitely experiencing the same one-track mind that plagued her in the opening area. Instead of leveling up or altering her loadout, she jumped right back into the action. It's completely understandable as her patience and optimism had reached all-time lows, but if she had any chance of ending this experiment with a victory, she'd need to adjust a variable. And so, we arrive at the final hour of this punishing journey. Ellie's last chance to claw her way toward further progress and end the adventure on a high note. This last chunk of gameplay was defined by a mounting sense of hopelessness. While Ellie's escalating frustration was on full display earlier in her play, her new attitude reflected a certain disconnection from the game itself. Likely due to her awareness of the lack of time remaining, Ellie began feeling that nothing she was doing even mattered anymore. She spent most of the time running through the well-traveled path towards the Taurus demon, occasionally just skipping enemies as the clock ran closer to 0. While she was playing, more than ever, Ellie spoke increasingly pessimistic rhetoric. She expressed her disappointment at her performance and shocked that she was stuck on the same section of the game after multiple hours. On a couple of occasions, she even said, "I feel stupid." Towards the end of the hour, she made it back to the Taurus demon and actually had her most successful attempt yet, but that didn't seem to serve as any consolation when the only reward seems to be another chance to read, "You died." As soon as it began, the last hour ended, and with that, Ellie's journey with Dark Souls had reached its conclusion. Over the entire playtime, she managed to accumulate 75 total deaths. So, what can we discern from this little experiment? It's difficult to extrapolate much that can be said for certain will apply to other games or other people, as this wasn't actually a formal experiment, but it says a lot about how these two variables interact. Dark Souls, despite being incredibly popular and critically acclaimed, possesses a pretty notorious reputation. As someone who has a lot of experience with these types of games, it's easy for me to lose sight of the degree to which it upholds its reputation. The fact of the matter is that Dark Souls is really hard, especially for someone who doesn't know how it functions, and even more so for someone who hasn't played many adjacent games. If Ellie had a more wide-ranging literacy of the medium, I think she would have gravitated to the leveling system, a mechanic common in most any RPG. Ellie has mostly played more action-oriented, linear experiences, which I think caused her to play Dark Souls more like a linear action game. She viewed it more through the lens of something like Uncharted, where success is attained through simple repetition. There's no leveling system in such a game, so the only way to progress through the relatively straightforward environments is to keep fighting until you can best your opponents. You can certainly play Dark Souls in that manner if you want to, and a willingness to embrace repetition is obviously important, but ultimately, Uncharted and Dark Souls delves into apples and oranges territory. Watching Ellie play also reminded me of the power that a tutorial possesses. Dark Souls does explain many of its mechanics and systems to the player, but offers little mercy if a player misses or simply forgets key information. For example, the game did teach Ellie how to target an enemy, but it never spent any more time explaining the use of doing so, or forced her to target additional combatants to get the hang of the tactic in actual combat. Because of this, Ellie forgot about targeting altogether, likely making the game harder for herself. Now, I'm not criticizing how Dark Souls teaches the player, mind you. I'm just noting that it's easy for experienced players to take certain information for granted. A lot of that just won't be as familiar to a newcomer and is even harder to retain in the context of a game that pushes the player so much. I could speculate forever, but I think it's more interesting to wind down with Ellie's own thoughts. I asked her if she actually enjoyed playing Dark Souls, and she said that essentially it was a mixed bag. She was intrigued by the gameplay and ultimately had the best time when she felt like she was making progress, which makes complete sense. When she overcame something challenging, she felt a genuine sense of accomplishment, but her least favorite part of the game was the immense frustration that accumulated before such accomplishment could be achieved. The most interesting comment that Ellie made is that it's hard for her to dive deeper into the minutia of a game if she's feeling confused, stuck, or frustrated. What's so fascinating about this statement in the context of Dark Souls is that her tendency to avoid more thorough exploration of the game's world and systems is a huge contributor to what made her so frustrated. It's the chicken or egg conundrum. The more her patience depleted, the more she inadvertently decreased her likelihood of making progress. Ellie said she'd play the game again, if only to prove to herself that she could take another boss down, but she doesn't envision herself ever actually completing the full game. For someone with so little experience, she made an impressive amount of progress, and I have a feeling that after watching this video, she could make a lot more. In the meantime, I think she's earned a long vacation from the untamed wilds of Lordran.